What happens when desire awakens in the most forbidden of places? The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Magnolia Grove plantation, casting long shadows across the mahogany floors of the master bedroom. Margaret Whitmore stood motionless by the tall window, her silk morning gown rustling softly as she adjusted the lace curtains. At 32, she possessed the refined beauty expected of a plantation mistress: porcelain skin, auburn hair always perfectly arranged, and green eyes that had once sparkled with the promise of a bright future. But those eyes now held something different, something hollow. If you're enjoying this story of forbidden desires and hidden truths, subscribe to our channel for more captivating tales that explore the depths of human emotion. The bedroom behind her told the story of her isolation. The four-poster bed, draped in expensive fabrics, remained perfectly made on both sides, a silent testament to the distance that had grown between her and her husband, Charles. The ornate furniture, imported from Europe, stood like monuments to a marriage that had become as cold and formal as the portraits hanging on the walls. Margaret's fingers traced the window frame as she gazed out at the grounds of their vast estate. The Georgia countryside stretched endlessly before her, dotted with cotton fields and the small cabins that housed the enslaved workers. It was a world she had been born into, a world she had never questioned until recently. Mrs. Whitmore, the soft voice of her lady's maid, Sarah, broke through her reverie. "Your breakfast is ready in the dining room." Margaret didn't turn around. "I'll take it here today, Sarah. By the window." Sarah hesitated. This had become a pattern over the past few months, the mistress spending hours at that window, barely eating, barely speaking. "Yes, ma'am. Shall I inform Mr. Whitmore?" "My husband left for Charleston before dawn," Margaret replied, her voice carrying no emotion. "Business matters as usual." As Sarah's footsteps faded down the hallway, Margaret allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been trying to ignore for weeks. Charles had been gone more often than not, claiming urgent business in the city. But she knew better. She had seen the way he looked at her, or rather the way he didn't look at her anymore. Their marriage had become a performance, played out for the benefit of society, while the truth festered in the silence between them. The sound of voices from the yard below drew her attention back to the window. The morning work was beginning, and the enslaved workers were gathering near the overseer's cabin. Margaret's eyes swept over the familiar scene, but today something was different. There, in the center of the group, stood a man she had noticed before but never truly seen. His name was Samuel, she knew that much. He had been brought to Magnolia Grove 3 years ago, purchased from a plantation in South Carolina. But standing there now, surrounded by the other workers, he seemed to command a presence that went far beyond his circumstances. Samuel was tall and powerfully built, his dark skin gleaming in the morning sun. But it wasn't his physical presence that caught Margaret's attention. It was the way the others looked at him. The women, in particular, seemed to gravitate toward him with an almost magnetic pull. Margaret watched as a young woman named Celia approached Samuel, her infant son balanced on her hip. She spoke to him in low tones, and Margaret saw something in Celia's expression that made her breath catch. It was a look of devotion, desire, something Margaret couldn't quite name but recognized with a painful clarity. Another woman, Ruth, stood nearby with her 2 small children clinging to her skirts. Her eyes never left Samuel's face as he spoke, and when he placed a gentle hand on one of the children's heads, Ruth's entire demeanor softened in a way that spoke of deep affection. Margaret found herself leaning closer to the window, her heart beating faster as she observed the scene. There were at least 6 women in the group, all of them mothers, all of them looking at Samuel with that same expression of reverence and longing. "What is it about him?" she whispered to herself, her breath fogging the glass. As if sensing her gaze, Samuel looked up toward the house. For a moment their eyes met across the distance, and Margaret felt something electric pass between them. She stepped back from the window quickly, her hand pressed to her chest, shocked by the intensity of her own reaction. But even as she retreated into the shadows of her room, she couldn't shake the image of those women surrounding Samuel, drawn to him like moths to a flame, and she couldn't ignore the uncomfortable truth that was beginning to surface in her own mind. When was the last time she had felt that kind of attraction to anyone? When was the last time she had looked at her own husband with even a fraction of the desire she had just witnessed in those women's eyes? The answer came to her with brutal honesty. Never. Margaret sank into the velvet chair beside the window, her carefully constructed world beginning to crack around the edges. She had been raised to be the perfect plantation mistress, gracious, obedient, decorative. She had married Charles because it was expected, because their families' lands adjoined, because it made economic sense. But she had never felt the kind of raw, undeniable attraction that she had just witnessed in the yard below. The morning passed slowly, but Margaret found herself returning to the window again and again. Each time, she told herself she was simply observing the work being done, ensuring that the plantation ran smoothly in her husband's absence. But deep down, she knew she was looking for Samuel. Around midday, she saw him again, this time working alone in the vegetable garden near the house. His shirt was damp with sweat, clinging to the muscles of his back as he worked the soil. Margaret watched the fluid grace of his movements, the way he seemed completely absorbed in his task. A knock at her bedroom door startled her from her observations. "Come in," she called, quickly moving away from the window. Sarah entered with a tea service, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. Patterson from Riverside Plantation has come to call. She's waiting in the parlor." Margaret smoothed her skirts and checked her reflection in the mirror. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes brighter than they had been in months. "Tell her I'll be down shortly." As she prepared to receive her guest, Margaret caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror. She was still beautiful, still young enough to bear children, still capable of inspiring desire. So why did she feel so invisible in her own home? The afternoon visit with Eleanor Patterson proved to be a welcome distraction, though Margaret found it difficult to concentrate on the usual gossip about social events and family news. Eleanor was a widow, having lost her husband to fever the previous year, and she spoke with the freedom of a woman who had learned to manage her own affairs. "You seem distracted today, Margaret," Eleanor observed over tea. "Is everything well?" Margaret forced a smile. "Of course. Charles is away on business and I find myself with too much time to think." Eleanor's knowing look suggested she understood more than Margaret had intended to reveal. "Marriage can be challenging, especially when one's husband is frequently absent. Have you considered taking on more responsibilities here at Magnolia Grove? Perhaps involving yourself more directly in the management of the plantation?" The suggestion was radical. Ladies of their social standing were expected to concern themselves with household matters, not the actual business of running a plantation. But something in Eleanor's tone suggested she spoke from experience. "What do you mean?" Margaret asked carefully. "Since William's death, I've had to learn every aspect of Riverside's operations. It's been enlightening. One discovers things about the people in one's employ that can be quite surprising." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Did Eleanor know what she had been observing from her window? What sort of things? Eleanor leaned forward conspiratorially. The dynamics among the workers, for instance. The natural leaders who emerge, the relationships that form. It's quite fascinating from an anthropological perspective. The word relationships hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Margaret found herself thinking again of Samuel and the women who surrounded him, of the looks of devotion and desire she had witnessed. After Eleanor departed, Margaret found herself alone again with her thoughts. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows, casting the house in golden light that somehow made her feel even more isolated. She returned to her bedroom window, drawn by a compulsion she didn't fully understand. The workday was winding down, and she could see the workers beginning to return to their quarters. Samuel was among them, walking slowly across the yard with several of the women from the morning. Margaret watched as they paused near the well. Samuel drew water for each of the women and their children, his movements gentle and considerate. When he handed the dipper to Celia, their fingers touched briefly, and Margaret saw the young woman's face light up with a smile that transformed her entirely. It was then that Margaret understood what she was witnessing. These women weren't just attracted to Samuel's physical presence. They were in love with him, all of them, and somehow, impossibly, he seemed to return their affection in equal measure. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Here, in the quarters of the enslaved workers, was more passion and genuine feeling than existed in the entire main house. These people, who had been stripped of everything, their freedom, their families, their very names, had somehow managed to create something beautiful and real. While she, with all her privilege and comfort, felt nothing but emptiness. As darkness began to fall, Margaret lit the oil lamp beside her chair and continued her vigil at the window. She told herself she was being foolish, that her fascination with the scene below was inappropriate and dangerous, but she couldn't look away. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, Margaret caught sight of herself in the mirror again. Her reflection looked back at her with eyes that held a new awareness, a recognition of something that had been missing from her life. For the first time in years, she felt truly awake. But with that awakening came a terrible question. What was she going to do about it? Sometimes the most dangerous discoveries are the ones we make about ourselves. 3 days had passed since Margaret's revelation at the window, and she found herself caught in a cycle of anticipation and self-recrimination. Each morning, she would position herself at the window under the pretense of overseeing the plantation's activities, but her eyes inevitably sought out Samuel among the workers. The more she observed, the more complex the situation became. It wasn't simply that the women were attracted to Samuel, it was the way he navigated their attention with a grace that seemed impossible given their circumstances. He was never dismissive, never cruel, yet somehow managed to give each woman the feeling that she was special while maintaining harmony among them all. Margaret had begun to keep a mental catalogue of the women in Samuel's orbit. There was Celia, barely 20, with her infant son Marcus; Ruth, older and more maternal, with her 2 children; a young woman named Lily, who couldn't be more than 18, who looked at Samuel with the desperate intensity of first love; and others, at least 4 more women who regularly sought his attention, his counsel, his presence. How does he do it? Margaret whispered to herself as she watched the morning routine unfold below. Samuel was helping Ruth repair a broken fence around the small garden plot behind her cabin, while Celia sat nearby nursing her baby. The scene was domestic, peaceful, and utterly foreign to Margaret's own experience of relationships between men and women. A soft knock interrupted her observations. Mrs. Whitmore. Sarah's voice was hesitant. The overseer, Mr. Jenkins, is here to see you. He says it's about the work assignments. Margaret reluctantly turned from the window. Thomas Jenkins was a crude man in his 50s, hired by Charles to manage the day-to-day operations of the plantation. She had always found him distasteful, but Charles insisted he was effective at maintaining order and productivity. "Send him to the study," Margaret replied. "I'll be down shortly." As she made her way downstairs, Margaret tried to compose herself. These meetings with Jenkins were always unpleasant. He had a way of looking at her that made her skin crawl, and he often made comments that bordered on inappropriate. But with Charles away, she had no choice but to deal with him directly. Jenkins was waiting in the study, his hat in his hands, but his posture suggesting anything but deference. He was a stocky man, with greying hair and small, calculating eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying a false note of respect. "I hope you don't mind me coming to the house, but there's a matter that needs your attention." "What is it, Mr. Jenkins?" Margaret took a seat behind Charles's desk, hoping the physical barrier would maintain some sense of authority. "It's about one of the field hands, Samuel. There's been some complications with his work assignments." Margaret's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. "What sort of complications?" Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, and Margaret noticed a calculating gleam in his eyes. "Well, ma'am, it seems he's been causing some disruption among the women. They're not focusing on their work like they should, always clustering around him, seeking his attention. It's affecting productivity." "I see." Margaret's mind raced. Was Jenkins testing her? Did he suspect her interest in Samuel? "And what do you propose to do about it?" "Well, ma'am, I think it might be best to separate him from the others. Maybe assign him to work the far fields away from the quarters, or—" Jenkins paused, his expression becoming more predatory. "We could sell him. I know of a plantation in Alabama that's looking for strong field hands. Might be the best solution all around." The suggestion hit Margaret like a physical blow. The thought of Samuel being sold, of never seeing him again, filled her with a panic that surprised her with its intensity. "That seems rather extreme, Mr. Jenkins," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "Surely there's a less drastic solution." Jenkins leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you don't mind me saying, sometimes a firm hand is needed to maintain order. These people need to understand their place, and when one of them starts getting ideas above his station—" "What exactly do you mean by that?" Margaret's voice carried a warning that surprised them both. Jenkins backtracked quickly. "Nothing inappropriate, ma'am. Just that Samuel seems to have developed quite an influence over the others, the women especially. It's not natural, if you understand my meaning." Margaret understood perfectly, and the implication made her blood boil. Jenkins was suggesting that Samuel's appeal to the women was somehow manipulative or coercive, when everything she had observed suggested the opposite. "I think you're overreacting, Mr. Jenkins," she said firmly. "Samuel has been a reliable worker since he arrived here. If the women seek his company, perhaps it's because he treats them with kindness, something that might be in short supply elsewhere." The barb hit its mark, and Jenkins's face darkened. "Mrs. Whitmore, with all due respect, you might not understand the complexities of managing these people. Your husband has always trusted my judgment in these matters." "My husband is not here," Margaret replied, rising from her chair, "and I am perfectly capable of understanding the situation. Samuel will remain in his current position. If you have concerns about productivity, perhaps you should examine your own management methods." Jenkins stood as well, his expression now openly hostile. "As you wish, ma'am, but don't say I didn't warn you when this situation gets out of hand." After Jenkins left, Margaret remained in the study, her hands shaking with anger and something else she couldn't quite name. The thought of Samuel being sold had awakened something fierce and protective in her, emotions she had no right to feel. She returned to her bedroom window, needing to see that Samuel was still there, still safe. The afternoon work was in full swing, and she spotted him immediately, working in the cotton fields with several other men. Even from a distance, she could see the easy camaraderie he shared with his fellow workers, the way they seemed to defer to his judgment on matters large and small. As she watched, Margaret noticed something that made her breath catch. Samuel had paused in his work and was looking directly at the house, directly at her window. Even across the distance, she felt the intensity of his gaze, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Then he raised his hand in what could have been interpreted as a simple gesture of acknowledgement, but Margaret felt it like a caress. Her heart pounded as she stepped back from the window, overwhelmed by the boldness of the moment. That evening, Margaret found herself unable to concentrate on anything. She picked at her dinner, abandoned her needlework, and paced the parlour like a caged animal. The house felt more oppressive than ever, its silence broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sounds of life from the quarters. Around 9 o'clock, she heard the sound of singing drifting across the yard. It was a common occurrence. The enslaved workers often gathered in the evenings to share music and stories, but tonight, something about the melody drew her to the window. The song was beautiful and mournful, a spiritual that spoke of longing and hope. Margaret could see figures gathered around a small fire near the quarters, their voices blending in harmony that seemed to rise up to the stars themselves. And there, in the center of the group, was Samuel. He wasn't leading the singing, but his deep voice provided a foundation for the others, a steady presence that anchored the melody. Margaret found herself leaning against the window frame, captivated by the scene below. As the song ended, she watched Samuel rise and begin to move among the group, speaking quietly with different individuals. She saw him place a comforting hand on the shoulder of an elderly man, share a laugh with a group of children, and exchange what looked like meaningful glances with several of the women. It was then that Margaret truly understood what she was witnessing. Samuel wasn't just attractive to these women because of his physical presence or even his kindness. He was their emotional center, their source of strength and comfort in a world that offered them little of either. And watching him, Margaret felt a longing so intense it took her breath away, not just for Samuel himself, but for what he represented: passion, connection, the feeling of being truly alive. She thought of her own life, of the careful routines and empty conversations that filled her days. When was the last time she had felt the kind of joy she saw in those women's faces when they looked at Samuel? When was the last time anyone had looked at her with that kind of devotion? The answer was never. And that realization was more painful than anything she had ever experienced. As the gathering below began to disperse, Margaret saw Samuel walking toward the main house. Her heart leaped into her throat as she realized he was heading for the kitchen garden, which was directly below her window. She watched as he knelt among the vegetable plants, his movements careful and deliberate in the moonlight. He was tending to the garden, she realized, work that wasn't required of him, but something he did out of care for the household. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was a man who had been stripped of his freedom, forced to work for no wages, treated as property, and yet he showed more consideration for her household than her own husband did. As if sensing her presence again, Samuel looked up toward her window. This time Margaret didn't retreat. She stood there, silhouetted against the lamplight, and met his gaze directly. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the divide of race, class, and circumstance. Margaret felt as though Samuel could see straight through to her soul, could read the loneliness and longing she had tried so hard to hide. Then Samuel did something that changed everything. He smiled. It wasn't a subservient smile or a polite acknowledgement. It was warm, genuine, and somehow intimate, the kind of smile shared between two people who understood each other without words. Margaret's hand flew to her throat, her pulse racing. She knew she should step away from the window, should end this dangerous moment before it went any further. But she couldn't move, couldn't break the connection that seemed to stretch between them like a physical thing. Finally, Samuel rose from his work and walked back toward the quarters, but not before giving her one last look that seemed to burn itself into her memory. Margaret sank into her chair, her entire body trembling. What was happening to her? What was she allowing to happen? But even as she asked herself these questions, she knew she was already lost. The careful walls she had built around her heart were crumbling, and she was powerless to stop it. For the first time in her life, Margaret Whitmore was truly awake to desire. And the object of that desire was the most forbidden man she could possibly choose. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret caught sight of herself in the mirror once again. But this time, instead of seeing a lonely, neglected wife, she saw a woman on the verge of a transformation that would change everything. The question was no longer whether she would act on her feelings. The question was what she was willing to risk for the chance to feel truly alive. The heart wants what it wants, regardless of the consequences. A week had passed since the moment at the window, and Margaret found herself living in a state of constant awareness. Every sound from the yard below made her pulse quicken. Every glimpse of Samuel sent electricity through her veins. She had tried to maintain her normal routines, but everything felt different now, charged with possibility and danger. Charles had returned from Charleston the previous evening, full of talk about cotton prices and shipping schedules. He had kissed her cheek perfunctorily and retired to his study with a bottle of brandy, leaving Margaret to dine alone once again. Their brief conversation over breakfast had been stilted and formal, two strangers sharing a table out of obligation rather than desire. "I'll be inspecting the fields today," Charles announced as he folded his newspaper. "Jenkins says productivity has been excellent in my absence." Margaret's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. "Has it? I hadn't noticed any particular changes." Charles looked at her with mild surprise. "You've been paying attention to the field work? That's unusual for you, my dear." The casual dismissal in his tone sparked something rebellious in Margaret's chest. "Perhaps I should take more interest in the management of our property. Mrs. Patterson has found it quite rewarding since her husband's death." "Eleanor Patterson is a widow with no choice in the matter," Charles replied curtly. "You are a married woman with a husband perfectly capable of handling such affairs. I hardly think it appropriate for you to concern yourself with the details of plantation management." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with indignation. "And what exactly should I concern myself with, Charles? My needlework? The latest fashions from Charleston? The weather?" Charles set down his newspaper and studied his wife with new attention. "Margaret, you seem agitated lately. Perhaps you should consider visiting your sister in Savannah. A change of scenery might do you good." The suggestion felt like a dismissal, another way for Charles to avoid dealing with the growing distance between them. "I have no desire to visit Savannah," Margaret replied firmly. "This is my home and I intend to remain here." After Charles left for his inspection, Margaret found herself pacing the parlor like a caged animal. The house felt smaller than ever, its elegant furnishings and carefully arranged flowers seeming to mock her with their perfection. Everything was beautiful, everything was proper, and everything was utterly lifeless. She made her way to the kitchen, ostensibly to discuss the evening's menu with Cook, but really seeking some human connection that felt genuine. The kitchen was the heart of the house, warm and bustling with activity, and Margaret had always found comfort there. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Cook said, looking up from the bread she was kneading. "What can I do for you today?" "I thought I might review the menu for tonight," Margaret replied, but her attention was drawn to the window that overlooked the kitchen garden. From this vantage point, she could see Samuel working among the vegetables, his movements efficient and graceful. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Cook's voice brought her back to the present. "The menu?" "Yes, of course." Margaret forced herself to focus on the conversation, but part of her mind remained fixed on the figure outside the window. "Whatever you think best, Cook. You know my husband's preferences." As they discussed the evening's preparations, Margaret found herself asking questions she had never thought to ask before. "Cook, how long have you been with us?" "Nearly 15 years, ma'am. Since just after you and Mr. Whitmore were married. And in all that time, have you been happy here?" Cook's hands stilled in their work, and she looked at Margaret with surprise. "Happy, ma'am? Well, I suppose I've been content. You and Mr. Whitmore have always been fair employers." Margaret realized how strange her question must have sounded. Ladies of her station didn't typically inquire about their servants' emotional well-being, but something about the morning's conversation with Charles had left her questioning everything about her life and the lives of those around her. "Cook, what do you know about Samuel, the man who tends the kitchen garden?" If Cook was surprised by the question, she didn't show it. "Samuel, he's a good man. Ma'am, came to us from the Hartwell plantation in South Carolina about 3 years ago. Works hard, never causes trouble. Has a way with growing things. The garden's never been more productive." "And the other workers? Do they respect him?" Cook's expression became more guarded. "He's well regarded, ma'am. Folks look up to him. He's got a gentle way about him, especially with the women and children. Lost his own family when he was sold away from his first plantation, so I think he tries to look after others who've suffered similar losses." The information hit Margaret like a physical blow. Samuel had lost his family, been torn away from people he loved, and forced to start over in a strange place. Yet instead of becoming bitter or withdrawn, he had opened his heart to others who shared his pain. "Thank you, Cook," Margaret managed to say. "That will be all for now." She left the kitchen with her mind reeling. Every new piece of information about Samuel only deepened her fascination with him. He wasn't just physically attractive or charismatic, he was genuinely good. A man who had suffered tremendous loss, yet still found ways to bring comfort and joy to others. The contrast with her own husband couldn't have been starker. Charles had been born into privilege, had never known real hardship or loss, yet he seemed incapable of genuine warmth or connection. Even with her, his own wife, he maintained an emotional distance that left her feeling invisible. That afternoon, Margaret found herself in the garden behind the house, ostensibly cutting flowers for the dining room table. In reality, she was hoping for another glimpse of Samuel, another moment of connection that would feed the hunger growing inside her. She didn't have to wait long. Samuel appeared around the corner of the house, carrying a basket of vegetables from the kitchen garden. When he saw her, he paused, and Margaret felt that familiar electric charge pass between them. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice low and respectful, but his eyes held something warmer, something that made Margaret's pulse quicken. "Good afternoon, Samuel," she replied, surprised by her own boldness in using his name. "The garden looks beautiful. You've done excellent work." "Thank you, ma'am. The soil here is good, and the plants seem to thrive with proper care." There was something in the way he said it that made Margaret wonder if he was talking about more than just vegetables. She found herself studying his face, noting the intelligence in his dark eyes, the strength in his features, the way his mouth curved slightly when he spoke. "Samuel," she said, then stopped, unsure of what she wanted to say. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. "Yes, ma'am?" His voice was gentle, encouraging. I wanted to thank you for your care of the household. I know it's not required of you, but I've noticed the extra attention you give to the gardens, the way you help the other workers. It doesn't go unappreciated." Samuel's expression softened, and for a moment Margaret saw past the careful mask he wore to the man beneath. "Everyone deserves kindness, ma'am. Even in difficult circumstances, we can choose how we treat one another." The simple wisdom of his words brought tears to Margaret's eyes. When was the last time anyone had spoken to her about kindness, about choice, about the fundamental dignity of human connection? "That's a beautiful sentiment," she whispered. "My grandmother used to say that love is the only thing they can't take away from us," Samuel continued, his voice barely audible. No matter what else happens, we can still choose to love. The word love hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond its simple definition. Margaret felt as though Samuel was offering her something precious, something she had been starving for without even realizing it. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Margaret managed to say. "She was. Lost her when I was sold away from my first home, but her words stayed with me." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could hear it nonetheless. Without thinking, she took a step closer to him, drawn by an impulse to offer comfort. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. "It must have been terribly difficult." Samuel looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected sympathy from the plantation mistress. "Thank you, ma'am. That's kind of you to say." They stood there for a moment, closer than propriety dictated, sharing a connection that transcended the boundaries of their respective positions. Margaret could smell the clean scent of his skin, could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell. Margaret stepped back quickly as Jenkins rounded the corner, his expression darkening when he saw them together. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jenkins said, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes suspicious. "I was looking for Samuel. There's work to be done in the far fields." "Of course," Margaret replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Samuel was just explaining the garden's progress to me." Jenkins's gaze moved between them, clearly sensing something, but unable to identify exactly what. "Samuel, you're needed immediately." "Yes, sir," Samuel replied. But before he left, he looked at Margaret one more time. "Ma'am, if you have any other questions about the garden, I'm always available to help." The offer was innocent enough on the surface, but Margaret heard the deeper invitation in his words. After he left with Jenkins, she remained in the garden, her heart pounding with the realization that she was standing at a crossroads. She could continue, as she had been, living a life of quiet desperation behind the facade of respectability. Or she could acknowledge the feelings that were growing stronger every day. Feelings that threatened to consume her with their intensity. That evening, as she sat across from Charles at dinner, Margaret felt as though she was seeing her husband clearly for the first time. He spoke about his day, about the plantation's business, about plans for expanding their cotton production, but his words seemed to come from a great distance. "Margaret, you're not eating," Charles observed. "Are you feeling unwell?" "I'm fine," she replied automatically, "just tired." "Perhaps you should retire early tonight. You've seemed distracted lately." Margaret looked at her husband, really looked at him. He was handsome enough, well-educated, financially successful. By all social standards, she should have been grateful for her marriage to him. But sitting there, listening to his dispassionate voice, she felt nothing but emptiness. "Charles," she said suddenly, "do you love me?" The question seemed to startle him. He set down his fork and studied her with confusion. "What a strange question, Margaret. Of course We're married. We have a comfortable life together." "That's not what I asked." Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't understand what's brought this on. We've been married for 10 years. Surely our feelings for each other are well established by now." Margaret felt something break inside her chest. Even when directly asked, Charles couldn't bring himself to say the words. Their marriage was a business arrangement, nothing more, and she had been fooling herself to think otherwise. "You're right," she said quietly. "Our feelings are well established." After dinner, Margaret excused herself and went to her room, but sleep was impossible. She found herself at the window again, looking out at the quarters where she could see the warm glow of lamplight in several cabins. Somewhere out there, Samuel was ending his day, perhaps sharing a meal with friends, perhaps comforting someone who needed his strength. He was living a life of genuine connection despite his circumstances, while she remained isolated in her gilded cage. As she stood there in the darkness, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't continue living as she had been, pretending to be satisfied with a marriage that offered her nothing but social status and financial security. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know how far she was willing to go to find the connection she craved. But she knew she couldn't turn back now. The woman who had been content to observe life from behind her window was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone willing to risk everything for the chance to feel truly alive. Tomorrow she would find a way to see Samuel again, and this time she wouldn't hide behind the pretense of casual conversation. It was time to discover what lay beyond the boundaries of her carefully constructed world. Some choices change us forever, and there's no going back to who we were before. The morning dawned grey and humid, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Margaret had barely slept, her mind churning with thoughts of Samuel and the decision she had made in the darkness of her room. As she dressed, her hands trembled with nervous energy, and she found herself choosing a simple day dress instead of her usual elaborate morning attire. Charles had left early for another trip to Charleston, this time to meet with potential buyers for the fall cotton crop. His departure had been perfunctory, a brief kiss on the cheek and a reminder to have Jenkins handle any issues that might arise. Margaret had nodded and smiled, playing the role of the dutiful wife one last time, but as his carriage disappeared down the tree-lined drive, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the next 3 days, she would be free to explore the feelings that had been consuming her. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Around mid-morning, Sarah knocked on her door with an unusual request. "Mrs. Whitmore, Cook is asking if you might speak with Samuel about the herb garden. She says some of the plants aren't thriving, and she thought you might want to discuss what changes to make." Margaret's heart leaped, but she kept her expression neutral. "Of course. Tell Cook I'll meet with Samuel in the garden after lunch." The hours until their meeting crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret tried to occupy herself with correspondence and household tasks, but her mind kept drifting to the conversation ahead. What would she say to him? How could she express the feelings that had been building inside her without crossing lines that could never be uncrossed? Finally, the appointed time arrived. Margaret made her way to the herb garden behind the kitchen, her pulse racing with anticipation and fear. Samuel was already there, kneeling among the plants with his back to her. The sight of him sent a familiar jolt of electricity through her body. "Samuel?" she called softly. He turned at the sound of her voice, and Margaret saw something in his expression that told her he understood. This meeting was about more than herbs. He rose gracefully to his feet, his eyes never leaving her face. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice carefully respectful but warm. "Cook said you wanted to discuss the garden." Margaret looked around to ensure they were alone, then stepped closer to him. "Samuel, I need to be honest with you about something." His expression grew more serious, but he didn't step away. "Yes, ma'am. I've been watching you," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "From my window, I've been watching you with the other workers, with the women, and I can't stop thinking about what I've seen." Samuel's eyes widened slightly, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "I see how they look at you," Margaret went on, her voice growing stronger. "I see the way you care for them, the way you make them feel valued and loved, and I find myself envying them." "Mrs. Whitmore," Samuel said quietly, "you're talking about dangerous things." "I know," Margaret replied, stepping even closer. "I know how dangerous this is, but I can't pretend anymore that I don't feel what I feel." I can't go back to my empty life and pretend to be satisfied with a marriage that offers me nothing but loneliness." Samuel looked around nervously, clearly aware of the risks they were both taking. "Ma'am, if anyone were to hear you talking like this—" "Then we'll have to make sure no one hears," Margaret said, surprised by her own boldness. "Samuel, I need to know something. When you look at me, do you see just another white woman to be served and obeyed? Or do you see me?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Samuel studied her face for a long moment, and Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out in his eyes. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see a woman who's been starving for kindness," he said. "I see someone who's forgotten what it feels like to be truly seen and valued. I see beauty that's been wasted on someone who doesn't appreciate it." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "And what do you feel when you see those things?" Samuel's resolve seemed to crumble. "I feel things I have no right to feel, things that could get us both killed if anyone suspected." "But you do feel them." "God help me, yes." The admission hung in the air between them, transforming everything. Margaret felt as though she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to leap into an unknown abyss. "Samuel," she whispered, "I need to understand something. All those women who surround you, who look at you with such devotion, do you love them?" Samuel's expression grew complex, layered with emotions Margaret was only beginning to understand. "I care for them deeply," he said carefully. "They've all suffered losses, been separated from families, forced to start over in a place that sees them as property rather than people. We find comfort in each other, create the family bonds that were taken from us. But is it love? The kind of love between a man and a woman?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words. "There's different kinds of love, Mrs. Whitmore. There's the love born of shared suffering, the love that comes from mutual care and protection. And then there's—" He paused, his eyes meeting hers directly. "Then there's the kind of love that changes everything, that makes you willing to risk everything." Margaret's heart pounded as she understood his meaning. "Which kind do you feel for them?" "The first kind," Samuel replied softly. "They're my family, my community. I would do anything to protect them and care for them." "And what kind do you feel for me?" The question was barely audible, but it seemed to echo in the space between them. Samuel's expression grew pained, as though he was fighting against something powerful and overwhelming. "Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret, I feel the kind that terrifies me." Hearing her name on his lips sent a shiver through Margaret's entire body. No one had spoken her name with such tenderness in years, perhaps ever. "I'm terrified too," she admitted. "But I'm more terrified of continuing to live the way I have been, feeling nothing, wanting nothing, being nothing more than a decoration in my own life." Samuel stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Do you understand what you're asking? What this could mean for both of us?" Margaret thought of Charles, of the life she had built, of the social expectations that had shaped every moment of her existence. Then she thought of the emptiness that had been consuming her, the slow death of living without passion or purpose. "I understand that I've been dead inside for years," she said, "and for the first time I feel alive. Whatever the consequences, I can't go back to being who I was." Samuel's hand moved as though he wanted to touch her face, but he stopped himself just short of contact. "Margaret, if we do this, if we cross this line, there's no going back. And the risks—" "I know the risks," Margaret interrupted. "But I also know that I'd rather face those risks than spend another day feeling invisible in my own life." They stood there for a moment, balanced on the knife's edge of decision. Margaret could see the war playing out in Samuel's eyes, desire battling with caution, hope fighting against fear. Finally, Samuel made his choice. His hand completed its journey to her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek with infinite gentleness. "Then God help us both," he whispered, and leaned down to kiss her. The kiss was everything Margaret had imagined and more. It was tender and passionate, desperate and reverent all at once. She felt as though she was drowning and being saved simultaneously, as though every empty moment of her life had led to this single point of perfect connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their faces flushed with desire and the magnitude of what they had just done. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, her voice shaky. Samuel's expression grew serious. "Now we have to be very, very careful. What we're doing, it's not just forbidden, it's dangerous. If anyone suspects—" "I know," Margaret said. "But Samuel, I need you to know something. This isn't just about physical attraction for me. It's about feeling connected to another human being for the first time in my adult life. It's about finding someone who sees me as more than just an ornament or a duty." Samuel's eyes softened. "You're so much more than that, Margaret. You're intelligent, compassionate, beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with your appearance. Any man who can't see that is a fool." The words were like balm to wounds Margaret hadn't even realized she carried. "How is it possible that you, who has every reason to hate people like me, can see things in me that my own husband can't?" "Because I know what it's like to be invisible," Samuel replied. "I know what it feels like to be seen as less than human, to have your thoughts and feelings dismissed as unimportant. I would never do that to another person, regardless of their circumstances." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. "I don't deserve your kindness." "Everyone deserves kindness," Samuel said, echoing the words he had spoken to her days earlier. "Everyone deserves to be seen and valued for who they really are." The sound of voices from the kitchen reminded them both of where they were and the dangers they faced. They stepped apart, reluctantly, the spell of the moment broken by the harsh reality of their situation. "We need to be careful," Samuel said again. If this is going to continue, we need to find safer ways to meet." Margaret's heart leaped at the implication that this wasn't just a single moment of madness. "What do you suggest?" Samuel thought for a moment. "There's an old cabin at the edge of the property near the creek. It's been abandoned for years, but it's still sound, if you could find reasons to walk in that direction." "Yes," Margaret said immediately. "I could say I'm collecting wildflowers or checking on the boundary markers." "When?" "Tomorrow evening, just after sunset." "But Margaret—" Samuel's expression grew grave. "You need to understand what you're risking. If we're discovered, I'll be killed. And you, your reputation, your marriage, your entire life will be destroyed." Margaret thought of Charles, of the empty conversations and loveless nights that stretched ahead of her if she chose safety over passion. "My life is already destroyed," she said quietly. "I've just been too afraid to admit it." Samuel studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow evening, but we must be extraordinarily careful." As they prepared to part ways, Margaret felt a desperate need to touch him again, to reassure herself that this moment had been real. She reached out and briefly took his hand, marveling at the strength and warmth of his fingers. "Samuel," she said softly, "thank you for seeing me, for making me feel alive again." "Thank you," he replied, "for having the courage to reach across the divide between us, for seeing me as more than just property." They separated then, Samuel returning to his work and Margaret making her way back to the house. But everything had changed. The air seemed clearer, the colors more vivid, her own body more alive than it had been in years. That evening, as Margaret sat alone in the dining room, she found herself thinking about the women who surrounded Samuel, who shared his affection and attention. For the first time, she understood what she had seen in their faces. It wasn't just desire or even love. It was the recognition of someone who valued them as complete human beings, who saw their worth beyond their circumstances. She thought about the conversation she had overheard between Charles and Jenkins weeks earlier, about the need to maintain order and keep people in their proper places. She realized now that what they feared wasn't disorder. It was the recognition of shared humanity that threatened the entire system they depended on. Samuel's ability to love and be loved, to create genuine connections despite the attempts to dehumanize him, was perhaps the most radical act of resistance possible. And by allowing herself to feel for him, Margaret was joining that resistance, stepping outside the narrow confines of her prescribed role. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret caught sight of herself in the mirror one final time. The woman looking back at her was transformed, her eyes bright with anticipation, her cheeks flushed with life, her entire bearing radiating a confidence that had been absent for years. Tomorrow evening, she would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. She would risk everything for the chance to feel truly connected to another human being. And for the first time in her adult life, Margaret Whitmore felt truly free. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke just before midnight, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rolling across the plantation. But Margaret wasn't afraid of the storm outside. She was thinking about the storm she was about to unleash in her own life, and she found herself eager to see where it would take her. In the quarters below, Samuel lay awake, listening to the rain, thinking about the woman who had changed everything with her courage and honesty. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new complications, new possibilities, but tonight, for the first time in years, both of them fell asleep with hope in their hearts and the promise of connection on the horizon. The reckoning had begun, and there would be no turning back. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of forbidden love and personal awakening. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more tales that explore the depths of human emotion and the courage it takes to live authentically. What did you think of Margaret's transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories.